Welcome back to VATSIM 101, everybody. Today, we are going to be talking about airports, focusing on the signage, how they're laid out, and what to look out for when you're taxiing around for your departure and your arrival. Airports come in a lot of different shapes, sizes, and layouts. Some are so small that their runways are made up of gravel, dirt, or grass. Others are so big that they need their own police, fire, and medical services. And then some are just straight up disrespectful. There are three different types of airports that you will be flying into on the VATSIM network. Commercial airports, which are going to be your larger international airports and your smaller regional airports. General aviation airports are going to be your smaller airports, which may be public or private use, just depending on that airport. They may have limited ATC coverage, or in some cases, be uncontrolled entirely. You may also find yourself flying into military airports, depending on the type of flying that you plan on doing. If you're somebody that's just starting out on VATSIM, you're probably not going to find yourself flying into or out of military airports very much, if at all, and they're going to be exclusive to military operations. You may find yourself flying into a commercial or a general aviation airport that has some sort of military installation attached to it, but military bases themselves are going to be exclusive to military traffic. As mentioned before, commercial airports are going to come in two different types. The first are the international airports, which are going to be very large, very complex airports. There'll be a high volume of traffic that operates in and out of there. The ATC communication is going to be very fast-paced, and there's going to be an expectation that you know what you're doing when you fly into and out of these types of airports. There are also going to be airports where you're going to see a lot of SIDs, stars, and published taxi routes. We already have a video on what SIDs and stars are, so if you have not checked out that video yet, and this is the first time you're hearing about it, I would highly recommend you check that out first. And this right here is an example of a taxi route that is published for the Atlanta airport. So on this chart right here, it's going to tell you exactly what you're going to be expected to do based on the taxi route that you're given by air traffic control. Regional airports are going to be smaller airports that will have regional aircraft that fly in there with a mixture of general aviation, just depending on that particular airport. They are much slower paced, and the procedures that are going into and out of those airports are going to be much easier for you to handle. If you're somebody that's trying to get into airline flying on the VATSIM network, the regional airports are really where you're going to want to start. General aviation airports can either be public or private use airfields. Some can be very small, like a lot of the remote airports up in Alaska where their runways are made out of gravel or dirt, and some GA airports can be as large as some regional airports. They may be able to accommodate bigger airplanes like 737s or 767s, but they're not equipped to handle airline-specific operations. Some general aviation airports may have a military installation that's attached to them, such as a National Guard wing, so you may see some military traffic flying into or out of those airports. Regardless of the type of airport that you're going to find yourself in, it's going to have two different types of areas within them: movement areas and non-movement areas. Non-movement areas are going to be the airport ramp and the vehicle access roads. At a lot of larger airports in the real world, they will be handled by what's called a ramp controller, which is typically handled by the airport itself, not necessarily by air traffic control. You're not going to encounter that a whole lot on the VATSIM network unless you're doing some kind of really big event. But for the purposes of VATSIM, if you're in a non-movement area, you are not going to be expected to contact air traffic control. Movement areas are under the direct control of ATC. Those are going to be taxiways and runways, some areas of the ramp depending on where that particular part of the ramp is located. For example, if the area of the ramp that you're on requires you to push back onto an active taxiway, that part of the ramp is going to be considered a movement area because you will need permission from air traffic control in order to start moving. Airports are going to have a lot of different markings and signage to help you figure things out, much like when you're driving in your car and you see a lot of signs on the road. These markings are going to be on the taxiways themselves. Now, as you can see, the descriptions of these signs gets kind of involved. We're going to break it down nice and simple for you. Starting at the top, we have the holding position line. This is going to be located where a taxiway meets a runway. It's broken down into two solid and two striped lines. If you are on the side of the solid lines, meaning when you taxi up to the position line, if the solid lines are on your side, that means you need to hold short of that line or do not proceed past it. If you are on the dashed line side, you can proceed over that holding short line. The second one is the ILS hold short line. This is going to be before the ILS critical area on the airport. This is mainly going to be used when the weather conditions at the airport are very low and they don't want your aircraft on the ground interfering with the ILS system for an airplane that is coming into land. Because it is possible for your plane to block the signal between the glide slope antenna on the side of the runway and the airplane that is coming in. You are only going to hold short of this line if the air traffic controllers tell you. The third type of marking is the taxiway holding position line. So you're going to see this when you're coming up on intersecting taxiways. You're not going to be expected to hold short of a taxiway unless an air traffic controller specifically tells you to. Number 4 is the non-movement area boundary. You're going to see this when a ramp or a non-movement area meets an active taxiway. So much like the holding position line, if you are on the side of the solid line, you will need to hold your position until the controller tells you to proceed. The next two are going to be taxiway edge lines. These will be on the outer edges of the taxiway. The solid 2 line means that the surface on the other side of that line is not going to be usable, so you don't want to cross that line. The dashed lines mean the surface beyond the taxiway is usable. So you'll see that a lot of times where there's a ramp area that's adjoined to a taxiway or something similar to that. But in both cases, they denote the edge of the taxiway. Next, we have a couple of different markings that are combined. So the red boxes up at the top that say 422 is just telling you that you're holding short of a runway. We're going to get into that particular sign in the next slide. Same with the boxes on the bottom where you have the yellow box with the black T and the black box with the yellow B. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. Right in the middle, you can see the taxiway center line and then one dashed line on either side of it. So the taxiway center line is where you want to have the nose wheel of your aircraft. That is going to guarantee your wingtip clearance to any obstacles that can be on either side. The dashed lines on either side is just an enhanced taxiway center line. You're normally going to see that when you're coming up to a runway, just as a little extra heads up that you are approaching a runway. On this slide, we have a whole bunch of different signs that you're going to see that are elevated from the airport surface. The first 3, for all intents and purposes, are the same sign. So in the first example, we see 4-22. This is going to accompany a holding position line for the runway. This sign is telling us that we are holding short of runway 4 and 22. Runway 4 is going to be to the left. Runway 22 is going to be to the right. And then the next sign, we have the inverse. Runway 22 is going to be to the left. Runway 4 is going to be to the right. These signs are going to be located on the left-hand side of the holding position line. The last one here where it says 4-approach, this means you're going to be at the approach end of runway 4. Next one down is going to accompany the ILS critical hold line. Not something you're going to hold short of unless air traffic control specifically asks you to. Next one down looks a lot like a do not enter sign because that's exactly what it's telling you. You do not want to proceed past that point. You're going to see this in areas that are not meant to accommodate aircraft. The next two are going to be location signs. So the first one shows that we are located on taxiway Bravo. The second one shows that we are located on runway 22. If you see a yellow letter or number on a black background, that means that is either the taxiway or the runway that you are located on. The next two down are going to be the holding position lines. The first one is the standard holding position line, and the last one down is going to be the ILS holding line. Next slide, we see a couple of directional signs. The first one is telling us that taxiway Juliet is off to the right. The next one shows that taxiway Lima is diagonally to the left of us. At some bigger airports, you may have a couple of different taxiways that are intersecting with each other, so make sure you're taking a look at those arrows carefully to know exactly what direction you're supposed to turn. And the next two after that is telling us that runway 22 is straight ahead and that the FBO is going to be kind of a sharp right-hand turn in almost the opposite direction. FBOs are where your GA aircraft are going to go. If you're flying airlines, this is not something you're going to have to worry about, but if you're flying as a GA aircraft, the FBO is typically where you're going to be parking. The next sign is an informational sign. This one is telling us that there's a noise abatement procedure in effect. You know my rules on noise abatement. Make the plane as loud as possible. Everybody in the area goes deaf. They never have to worry about hearing anything ever again. Next is the taxiway ending marker. This is going to tell you when you're coming to the end of a taxiway. And then the last one down is the runway distance remaining in thousands of feet. Next, we have the markings that are on the runways. The runway is going to be lined with centerline stripes. They're going to be 120 feet long, 3 feet wide, and spaced 80 feet apart. I don't know what meters are. I can't do that conversion for you. At the very beginning of the runway, we have the threshold markings. This is where the usable landing area of the runway begins. The number of stripes that you see on the threshold is going to tell you how wide the runway is. Now, I'll step out of the way so you can see the grid for the threshold stripes. So you can pause to read here. But you can see on this grid, it tells you how wide the runway is depending on how many threshold stripes you see. Just past the threshold markings, you're going to see the runway number. Runways are numbered based on what direction they face, rounded to the nearest 10 with the last 0 omitted. So for runway 19, the runway faces on a bearing of 190 degrees. The next set of markings are known as the touchdown zone. For airliners and your larger jets, the touchdown zone is where you're going to be looking to put the airplane down. With your smaller smaller general aviation planes, you're typically looking for the third centerline stripe. With larger complex aircraft, you're looking for the touchdown zone. Specifically, the aiming point, which is either going to be 1,000 feet or 1,300 feet down the runway, depending on if it's complying with the ICAO standards or not. And the reason it's 1,300 feet for an ICAO airport is because the aiming point is located 400 meters down the runway, whatever a meter is. Each one of these touchdown zone markings are going to be spaced 500 feet from each other, and that's going to be from where that particular marking begins. Here we have the markings for a displaced runway threshold. This means the landing area of the runway is going to start further down than where the surface of the runway begins. A lot of times these are going to be for noise abatement or obstacle clearance procedures. On both of these runways, you can see that there are areas of yellow. On the left, you're going to see yellow chevrons. This means that that portion of the surface is not usable. So it's not reinforced. If you taxi onto that, your plane is going to sink right through it and get stuck in position, at least in the real world. I haven't really put that to the test in Microsoft Flight Simulator or X-Plane yet. On the right-hand side, we can see that there is a taxiway leading up to the runway. The surface with the white arrows can be used for your takeoff roll and your landing roll, but you cannot touch down on that surface. Your touchdown has to be beyond the runway threshold. Next slide we have here shows us some airport lighting. So starting over with the taxiway all the way to the left-hand side, the taxiway edge lights are going to be blue. The taxiway centerline lights are going to be green. And then just before the runway, we can see a series of yellow lights. That is going to denote our holding position line. And then to the left and the right, you're going to see the yellow and black, what are called elevated runway guard lights. So that's going to be a sequence of flashing lights. That's an added warning that you're approaching a runway. Somebody out there is still going to cross the hold position line. On the runway itself, there are quite a few different types of light that you'll need to be familiar with. The runway edge lights themselves are going to be white, and at the last 2,000 feet of the runway, they're going to be yellow, just to help you identify that the end of the runway is approaching. The runway centerline lights are going to be white. Once you get to the last 3,000 feet of the runway, they're going to alternate red and white. Then the last 1,000 feet, they're all going to be red. The touchdown zone lights are going to be all white. It won't specifically tell you where the 500-foot marker is, the 1,000-foot marker is, where the aiming point is. It's just going to show you in general where the touchdown zone is. At the end of the runway, you'll have the runway end lights, which are going to be red to let you know that's the end of the runway. And these are also going to be shared with the runway threshold lights that will be green. And in this diagram, you can see the lens of the actual bulb is going to be split between the colors. And a lot of airport lights are set up like this. When you're approaching from one side, it's going to be one color. When you're approaching from the other side, it's going to be a different color. The runway centerline lights and the runway edge lights operate like this too. Some runways on either side of the threshold are going to have runway end identifier lights, which are two blinking white lights that are going to help you identify where the runway begins. The next set of lights we see off to the right are going to be the approach lights. We're not going to get too far into what all of those lights mean. Just very important to know, the approach lights are not part of the landing surface, so please, for the love of God, do not try to land on the approach lights. Depending on the type of airport that you're flying into, may have some or none of these lights for you to reference. So always make sure you are consulting the airport documentation to know exactly what you can expect. Next, we have the visual glide slope indicators, or VGSI, as you may see on some of your airport documentation. Visual glide slope indicators are going to be positioned on one or both sides of the runway, and they're going to help you figure out how high or low you are on the approach. The first one we have is the Precision Approach Path Indicator, also known as the PAPI. This will be a series of 4 red or white lights, and right here it tells you what each configuration means. So if you see all white lights, that means you're too high. If you see 3 white with 1 red, it means you're slightly too high. If you see 2 white and 2 red, that means you're on the glide path. 1 white and 3 red, you're slightly below the glide path. All 4 red lights means you're way below the glide path. The second one we have here is the Visual Approach Slope Indicator, also known as a VASI. The VASI is going to be 2 pairs of lights rather than 4 individual lights. If you see 2 red lights over 2 red lights, that means you're below the glide path. Red lights over white lights, you're on the glide path. White lights over white lights, that means you're too high. There's an old saying, red over red means you're dead. I refuse to say unalived unironically. Red over white, you're all right. White over white, you'll fly all night. Before we wrap things up, let's go go over some considerations for when you're operating at an airport. Number one, make sure the field that you're flying into can handle the type of aircraft that you're flying. You don't want to be flying a really large airplane into an airport that can't handle it. I know it's fun for people to fly an A380 into St. Bart's or Lukla, but when you're flying on the VATSIM network, it's really something that you want to avoid. Just keep in mind that there are going to be people on the network with you, and you don't want to be disruptive. Familiarize yourself with the airport layout. Know where the terminal is, and get an idea as to how you think you're going to be taxiing to the runway for departure, and how you're going to taxi to the ramp once you land. The instructions that the controller gives you may be different than what you have originally planned, but you at least want to get familiar with what the airport looks like, so that way when you're given instructions, you know the general direction that you have to go to get there. And as mentioned before, make sure you're taking a look at any taxi routes that could be published on the airport charts. Keep in mind that some airports may have intersection departures, meaning that you're not going to use the full length of the runway to take off. They may have you take off from a taxiway further down the runway. One that I run to all the time, I think it's runway 10 left at Chicago O'Hare. A common intersection departure is from taxiway Delta Delta, which is, I want to say, 1,000 feet down from the runway threshold. And make sure that you run your performance data to ensure that it's something that you can do. Something that I've also come across mainly in the A350 and the A380 is something called brake to vacate, where you can program the plane's auto braking system to have you exit the runway at a certain taxiway. Want to make sure that you're getting off the runway at the first practical taxiway. Don't extend your rollout any longer than you need to, because there are going to be planes coming in behind you. So when you run your landing performance data and it tells you how long your landing rollout's going to be, look for the first taxiway that comes after that number and get off there. And that'll wrap up today's lesson, everybody. I know there's a lot of information that we went over, and it can be really confusing, especially the first time that you find yourself in an airport, which is why I always stress when you're first starting out on the network that you pick a smaller airport that is going to be much easier for you to navigate. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into today's lesson. If you do have any questions, you can feel free to leave them in the comments section below. And until next time, this is Cross Hyperu signing out.